Good evening, and thank you for joining the Westerly Library in Wilcox Park for tonight's program. This program is being presented using the webinar version of Zoom, and attendees are joining in listening mode only. Please send any and all questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to answer all questions within the time we have allotted for this program. Please note that this program is being recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel as soon as possible. Should you get disconnected, simply use the link that was emailed to you earlier to get back into the program. Lane Sparkman is Associate Director of Education and Public Programs for the Rhode Island Department of State. She develops public programs, curates exhibitions, and creates educational materials for teachers, students, and the general public in support of the department's mission to make government more accessible and inspire civic pride. Lane conceived of and curates Treasures from the Archives, a pop-up exhibition series in the State Library, created Roving Roger, the traveling exhibit featuring the 7-foot-tall statue of Roger Williams that we hosted at our library in 2019, and manages the State House tour programs, which typically receives about 17,000 visitors per year. I will now turn it over to our guest speaker for tonight, Lane Sparkman.
Thanks so much, Amanda. So good evening, everyone. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And I hope that everyone in 1 minute is going to see a lovely picture of the Rhode Island State House on the screen. And so my task tonight is to take you on a virtual tour of this building. As I hope you all know, it is a free building. It's open to the public. When it's not a pandemic, it's open Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 4:30. We offer free tours of the building, and you can also just come in and stroll around, at your leisure. So I hope if you haven't been to the State House in person before, that maybe this tour will inspire you to visit it in the future, and also give you some information that you wouldn't necessarily have if you were visiting for the first time, not having toured before. So the State House is, this iconic building. It sits up on the top of Smith Hill in the center of downtown Providence. It's all made out of marble quarried in the state of Georgia, and marble was, a very fashionable building material at the time that the State House was built, which was right around the turn of the century. So they started construction in 1895 and they finished in 1904. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I want to point out first, before we go back in the history of the State House, the figure on top of the State House, which probably most of you know as, forgive the ad on Flickr. Why is it doing this? Hang on. There we go, as the independent man. So there has been lots of discussion about how this statue came to be on top of the State House. What did they intend for it to be? Was it supposed to be a woman? In one of the early drawings by the architects, the figure on top of the State House actually was a female figure. So there's been speculation that maybe the original intention was to have it be a woman. And I'm pointing this out partly because it is March is Women's History Month, and we're just reaching the end of that. So I'll have a little bit of a focus on women's history during the tour. But in the statue that ended up being put on top of the State House was this figure originally titled Hope, which of course is our state motto, but it was given this nickname, the Independent Man, because Rhode Island has such a terrific and interesting history of independent thinkers and independent actors. And we'll talk a little more about that when we're inside the building and talking about some of the history. But you can see he stands on top of the State House. It's a bronze statue that's been gilded. He holds in his left hand the top of an anchor, a classic symbol of Rhode Island, and is recognized, around the state, really now known as the Independent Man. So I mentioned that the State House was built at the turn of the century, but of course we had a government before 1895. And what a lot of people don't know about Rhode Island government is that it actually used to meet in 5 different state capitals. So you can see here pictures of the 5 original capitals. We had one in Providence and one in Newport, and those were probably the most important capitals. But we also had a capitol building in Kingston, East Greenwich, and then the last one to be built was in Bristol. So at its height, we had this period of a rotating legislature when the entire legislature would move from one building to another, depending on the time of year. And when you go into the library with my colleague, Meg Hamlin-Black, she'll talk a little bit about the records that we have that say, at a meeting in Newport in September, at a meeting in Providence in October, et cetera, and so forth. The great news is all of these buildings still exist, and maybe some of you have visited some of them. So in Newport, Colony House is a tourist site, and it's managed by the Newport Historical Society. In Kingston, the building is now used as the Kingston Library. The East Greenwich building is used as the Town Hall. The Providence building is home to the Historic Preservation and Heritage Commission. And actually the first floor is open to the public. So you can go and see the old Senate chamber, whenever the building is open. And then the Bristol building is actually probably the most underused of the State House, the original State House buildings. It's been occupied by a number of different nonprofit organizations, including a theater. They were doing theatrical productions there for a little while. Right now, I don't think anyone is using it as a regular office space, but you can arrange to visit it if you like. Anyway, so Rhode Island is the only state that had essentially five simultaneous capitals. Other states did have legislatures that moved maybe between two cities, but for such a small state to have five capitals, is sort of extraordinary. But in any case, eventually this system became impractical. You can see these buildings are a lot smaller than our present state capital. Transportation had gotten easier, so it wasn't so onerous for people to connect with their government, by getting to Providence. Government had gotten a lot bigger, and Providence had become the center of industry in Rhode Island. So when they had to choose one capital city, they chose Providence. And in order to choose an architecture firm to design the building, they actually had a competition. And the competition began in Rhode Island. And then they had a number of Rhode Island entries, and then they opened it up to the whole country. And the winning design was submitted by the architecture firm of McKim, Mead, and White, based in New York City. McKim, Mead, and White were incredibly well-known and well-respected architects from that period. They had recently been sort of among the headliners from the Chicago World's Fair. They had designed parts of the Columbia University campus, the Boston Public Library, a number of buildings in Rhode Island, the Narragansett Casino, the Newport Casino, et cetera. So it was kind of no surprise that McKim, Mead, and White were the winners of the commission. The photo that you see here is actually one of McKim, Mead, and White's best known buildings, sadly no longer standing. This is the old Penn Station in New York City. So typically, if you've heard of one building by McKim, Mead, and White, besides the State House, it's the old Penn Station. So that's an exterior shot, and this is an interior shot. And this is a building that was built actually after the State House in around 1910 or so, 1910. And sadly torn down about 50 years later to make room for Madison Square Garden. And the destruction of that building was one of the things that really galvanized the historic preservation movement in New York. In any case, so McKim, Mead, and White submitted, my goodness, I'm really sorry for these ads. This is a new feature of Flickr. There we go. McKim, Mead, and White designed the winning, submitted the winning design for the building. And this is part of what you would see if you were visiting the State House in person. The building has two entrances. The one that we saw in the first photograph, which is the side that faces the city of Providence, or at least faces Narragansett Bay more accurately, that was designed as the pedestrian entrance. And this entrance that we see here, which is the entrance that's used day to day in the present, was actually designed as the carriage entrance. So it's not an especially friendly pedestrian entrance, but it is the one pedestrian entrance that we use currently. Until I believe it was 9/11 when, previous to 9/11, both entrances were used regularly. And then when security measures were increased as a result of 9/11, they closed off the pedestrian entrance and just allowed people to come and go through the carriage entrance. We do look forward to maybe trying to have at least some days in the year where we have the pedestrian entrance open, but that's a work in progress. In any case, so if you were visiting the State House today, you would hop out of your car on Smith Street and you would see this big, beautiful plaza, all part of the McKim, Mead, and White design, and this three-arched entryway, which is where we'll go next. So here we are on the other side of those doors. You can see there's the little security area. And now you can see up close the marble that the building is made out of. So as I mentioned, this is all quarried in the state of Georgia. And the marble was chosen for its strength. It's actually an incredibly strong stone, and also for its beauty and its popularity at that time. The Chicago World's Fair that I mentioned earlier, they called that the White City because all of the buildings in the World's Fair were white, all sort of pretending. They weren't actually marble, they were just pretending to be marble. But It was kind of the fashionable way to make a building, or fashionable material for a building. You can see also that some of the colors are different. So all of this is marble, the inlay and the floor that are slightly different colors. So it's used both decoratively and, as just a straightforward building material. When you come in the front doors of the State House, this is really the view that you get. And this is a view right up into the Rotunda, which is the central area of the building. And this is actually kind of a great photograph to notice the way these columns are angled so that everything is kind of driving you up the stairs and into the Rotunda area. So that was very much by design. McKim, Mead and White wanted you to end up in this area kind of as your first experience of the State House. So that's where we'll go now. So this is the Rotunda area. This is the geographic center of the building. This is also the most important part of the building, I would say, for people moving through the building. It's an incredibly active, dynamic space. And as one architectural historian pointed out to me once, he said, often rotundas are kind of static spaces. It's where a body might lie in state in the rotunda. But here, this rotunda is an incredibly active, busy space. People often ask, oh, do you ever see the governor, when you're in the State House? And I used to see the governor quite a lot, in the pre-pandemic period. And I almost always saw her going up or down these stairs on the way to her office or to her car or to a meeting. So it is a really interesting way that the architects were able to use design to create a place where people interact and see each other. From the rotunda, you can also look up and see all of the principal rooms on the second floor. So these are the stairs up to the House chamber. Here you can see the doors to the library. These stairs lead to the Senate chamber. And then behind us over here would be the entrance to the stateroom, the governor's stateroom. And we'll visit all of these rooms, during the course of the tour. You can also look up and see the beautiful dome up overhead, and it's a little dizzying, honestly, when you look straight up there when you're standing in the rotunda. But it's a really amazing view. The other thing about the rotunda that's important to know is that it's also one of the most active public spaces in the building. I mean, it's not a formal space. It's kind of it's hallway basically, but it's incredibly actively used when the legislature's in session by people coming to demonstrate, to let the legislature know how they feel about a bill that's being considered. So this next photograph I'm going to show you is, this is I think from a couple of years ago, and you can see that there are people with blue signs and people with pink signs. So these are people who are on opposite sides of an argument. In this case, it was a bill about reproductive health, and they've all come to the State House to demonstrate and also to testify, at the bill hearings. So it's actually one of the most wonderful things to see in the building is when the public comes and fills these stairs, fills the rotunda, fills the hallways, all to, engage with their government, let their elected officials know how they feel about whatever the legislation is that they're considering. In the center of the rotunda, right here, you can see the state seal. Gosh, I just cannot apologize enough for flicker. There we go. So this is the state seal. You can see it says Seal of the State of Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. And down here, this date, 1636. And in the middle of the seal, we have an anchor, this shield that has the anchor, and over the anchor is the word hope. So as I'm sure you all know, this is no longer our state name. Back in the fall, during the election cycle, we actually voted on a referendum, and the majority chose to remove Providence Plantations from our state's name. So I don't know what this means for the building. It's definitely, there's an article in the Providence Journal just recently about, how are we going to manage the many places in the State House where it says Providence Plantations. In some cases, it's very integrated with the architecture, as I would argue it is here, and as it is on the entablature of the building on the exterior. And then other places where it's quite easy to remove. So we'll see what happens. But in any case, this is the state seal. And then 1636 refers to the year that Roger Williams came and started the colonial settlement of Providence. And we'll talk more about that when we go up to the third floor, which is actually where we're headed now. Any questions before we talk about the third floor and the dome? Okay, I'm just going to keep moving on, but if you do have a pressing question, feel free to put it in the question and answer, and Amanda will bring it to me. So now we're looking up, and we're on the 3rd floor of the building. If we look down, we can see the seal that we were just looking at. Down here is the entrance to the building. You can see the 2nd floor hallway, the 3rd floor hallway, and another view of the dome up overhead. I also want to draw your attention to this lighting fixture though, this chandelier that has many, many light bulbs and exposed light bulbs. And this actually is revealing. This gives us a little bit of an indication about the time when the building was built. So the State House, as I said, was built at the turn of the century. During that period, electricity was a brand new, exciting invention. And so McKim, Mead, and White wanted to make sure that everybody noticed that the State House had electricity. So it's, on display here in this chandelier. You'll see it in most of the major rooms we visit are going to have light bulbs all around the perimeter, sometimes fancy light fixtures. And that was all very much by design so that people would say, ooh, ah, the Rhode Island State House, what a fancy place, it has electricity. And really the whole building, including, this lavishly decorated dome area, is all testament to the fact that Rhode Island was actually a very wealthy state at the turn of the century. We were, in fact, the richest state per capita in the country at the time that the State House was built. And so, we're kind of showing it off in this building. So you can see actually curiously, let me back up. So the building is on the National Register of Historic Places. So that means that we try to keep it looking as much as possible, as much as is reasonable, the way it looked when it was completed in 1904. But there are, of course, some modern changes to the building. And in fact, this mural decoration is not original to the building. This was done in the 1940s, but it's so much a part of the fabric of the building that I think anyone would argue that it's part of the historic fabric, today. So there are some paintings around the lower part here show supporting the dome. These are representations of literature, justice, education, and commerce. And then you can see this writing in this blue band. This is a quote from a Roman historian called Tacitus. And it says, translated to, a rare felicity of the times when you can think what you like and say what you think. So that's a very Rhode Island idea, this independent idea, but it actually comes from a Roman historian. But I'm actually going to focus on the very top here, this section of the dome, which for the longest time, people referred to it as the Four Freedoms. Based on the research I've done, I don't think that was a title that the artist ever intended for this painting. If you read contemporary accounts of when the painting was done, they refer to it as scenes showing the origins of Rhode Island's greatness, which I think is a wonderful kind of hyperbolic phrase, but I prefer to think of it that way. The Four Freedoms actually was a painting series by Norman Rockwell. It refers to one of Roosevelt's famous speeches. So I think people just, that happened at the same time that this was painted. So I think those different things got sort of conflated together. In any case, so the mural has 4 scenes from Rhode Island history. And I'm starting here with the earliest scene, which is meant to show Roger Williams, he's the man in blue here, talking with 2 sachems from the Narragansett tribe, whose names are Canonicus and Miantinomi. And we know a fair amount about Canonicus and Miantinomi because they were 2 of the most important Narragansett leaders, during this early colonial settlement period. And they ended up making a lot of the agreements, land agreements with colonists in that period. So a couple of important things about this. Number one, the State House was built on Narragansett land, right? The Narragansetts were the sovereign nation of this part of what we call Rhode Island today. The other indigenous people who were most active and living in what we call Rhode Island today were the Pokanoket or Wampanoag tribe and the Niantic tribe. And they'd been living here for tens of thousands of years before Roger Williams and his settlers and friends arrived. But when Roger Williams arrived in 1636, he recognized that there had been people living here. And unlike most of his English contemporaries, he said, well, I don't think we can just build our houses wherever we want to. We need to make an agreement with the people who are already here and make sure that we can inhabit this land. And so he, in fact, did make an agreement with Canonicus and Miantinomi, allowing him to establish the settlement of Providence on land as I said, where the State House is today, and down the hill to where the Roger Williams National Memorial is today. And in fact, that's probably close to where this agreement was forged, is down by the Roger Williams National Memorial. So that's one of the, Roger Williams was a very progressive thinker in many ways. And one of them was in his recognition of the rights of the Narragansett and Wampanoag people to this land. To back up a little bit on Roger Williams, he was an Englishman, right? He was born in England in 1600. He moved to Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630, trying to get away from the rules around religion that he was experiencing in England. But in Massachusetts, he found basically the same rules. He found the same rules, and he was so outspoken about his ideas, and his ideas can be distilled into the separation of church and state and or religious freedom. And he was very outspoken about these ideas. He would talk to people all the time, which was generally described as preaching by the Massachusetts Bay authorities. And they said, Roger Williams, you may not preach these new and dangerous opinions of yours. That's what that his crime ultimately was, for having new and dangerous opinions and preaching about them. So they banished him from Massachusetts, sent him here, or sent him away rather, and he chose to start his new settlement in what we call Providence today. And that was because he had developed a relationship, a friendship with the Narragansetts and Wampanoags, and also because there was no colony here yet, right? There was a colony in Connecticut, there was, Massachusetts and Plymouth colonies existed north of here, but there wasn't any formal colonial settlement in what we call Rhode Island today. The other important thing about Roger Williams that I forgot to mention is that in addition to being forward-thinking about land ownership, he also recognized that it would be in his best interest, honestly, to learn the language of the Narragansett people. And so he learned Algonquin, which is kind of like the parent language for a lot of the New England tribes. He learned that the Algonquin language shortly after arriving in the colony in Massachusetts, and ended up writing the very first translation dictionary of Algonquin to English. And that dictionary included both, straight translations, but also little essays about how the indigenous people lived, what were their family structures like, what did they eat, how did they hunt, et cetera. And that book turned out to be a bestseller in London, where it was ultimately published. In any case, so Roger Williams started the settlement of Providence on the basis of freedom of religion. And so that's what this next scene in the mural is showing us, is people who have come to Rhode Island to worship as they wish, right? To worship in different ways. So, we can see people are kneeling, some are standing, some have books. This is actually my favorite detail, which is, you can sort of see if you're at the State House in person, but it's much easier to see here. He's wearing a yarmulke, so a clear depiction of Judaism. And, remembering that it was illegal to be Jewish anywhere but Rhode Island in the early colonial period. So that's what this scene is illustrating, is this idea that Roger Williams introduced in Rhode Island of freedom of religion. The next scene in the mural shows basically early Rhode Islanders starting out their new lives. So you can see these men have building implements. This person's got a plow for farming. This person's got an anchor, getting ready to go to sea. So just some of the activities of early Rhode Islanders. And then the final scene in the mural shows the beginnings of industry in Rhode Island. So some of you may know that Rhode Island is home to the Slater Mill, which is considered the first successful factory in America. It was a water-powered textile factory. And so that's what these three figures are reminding us of. You can see she's got this big spool of thread, and then these women are holding a long bolt of cloth, reminding us of the many, many textile factories, located throughout Rhode Island. And here, these men are holding silver vessels, reminding us of, the jewelry industry and the metalsmithing industry, including things like the Gorham Manufacturing Company, who actually were the company who cast the Independent Man statue on top of the State House. Over here, you can see a man holding a book and this rolled up piece of paper that's probably a newspaper, just reminding us of the importance of printed materials at a time, before radio and internet and television and all the ways we get our news today. All right, so we're going to go now down to the second floor of the building. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Otherwise, I'll keep going. Okay, so we're on the second floor. This is actually a view into the library where my colleague Meg will take you shortly. But first we're going to look at some of the other major rooms on this floor. So again, looking down, you can see the seal that we talked about earlier. You can see the dome over our heads and the stairs to the two legislative chambers, and across the way, the entrance into the stateroom. So that's where we're actually going to go next. Oh no, I forgot, sorry, it's Women's History Month. Before we do that, so the State House, the tradition is that every governor of Rhode Island has a portrait painted, and those portraits hang on the walls of the State House. And until Governor Raimondo was elected, we had never had a female governor. So there were literally no depictions of women in the entire State House. So there was a commission set up, and they identified 2 women that should be commemorated in the State House. This was probably 15 or 20 years ago now. The first is Elizabeth Buffum Chase. So Elizabeth Buffum Chase was an abolitionist, a suffragette, and an educator. So she and her husband harbored fugitive enslaved people through their Underground Railroad system. She started a school for Rhode Island orphans so that even if they lost their parents, they could still get a good education. And, you know, my favorite thing about her, I think, is that she actually submitted the very first petition for women's suffrage to the Rhode Island General Assembly in 1867. And then she went on to co-found the Rhode Island Women's Suffrage Association at around the age of 65 or so, which, you know, in the 1800s was actually, you know, kind of old. So she was really an amazing figure. Her petition for women's suffrage is a wonderfully written document. It says something like, you know, women must follow the laws, in the making of which they have no voice. In any case, so she helped launch the women's suffrage movement in Rhode Island. And of course, it would be decades later that finally the 19th Amendment was passed in 1920. So sadly, she did not live to see that. So this is Elizabeth Buffum Chase. And then the other woman who is commemorated in the State House is Christiana Carteau Banister. There we go. Christiana Carteau Bannister lived around the same time as Elizabeth Buffum Chase. She was a woman of Narragansett and African descent. She was married to a man named Edward Banister, who was an African-American man who was a very well-respected landscape painter. But Christiana Bannister was an entrepreneur. She was actually described as a hair doctress, which is basically a wig maker. And she had shops in Providence and in Worcester and in Boston. And through her business activities and her partnership with her husband, she and he together provided funds for the Black Regiment of Massachusetts, who, when they returned from the Civil War, were not actually paid the wages they'd been promised. They were paid, you know, half the wages or fewer wages than their white counterparts. She and her husband also were co-founders of the Providence Arts Club, which went on to be one of the founding partners for the Rhode Island School of Design. And she also founded something that today we call Banister House, but originally it was called the Home for Aged Colored Women. And it was a place that she created to give African-American domestic servants a place to go to spend their final years when they were no longer able to be servants. They could come and live their final years in Banister House. So, you know, or the Home for Aged Colored Women. So Banister House, as it is known today, still exists. It has a different mission, of course, but it is an incredible legacy to the accomplishments of this woman, you know, back in the end of the 19th century. Okay. This is a new thing that Flickr is doing, and I'm not sure what to do about it. I'm going to go like this. Okay. The newest commemoration or celebration of women in the State House is this sculpture here. And this was actually commissioned by the Secretary of State to remember the first women elected to office in Rhode Island, elected to state office in Rhode Island. So going back to the very first female legislator was a woman named Isabel Ahern O'Neill, and then going right up to Governor Raimondo, the first female governor. So this was a statue or a sculpture that was commissioned from the Steel Yard based in Providence, and it was completed in the middle of the pandemic. So it had a very quiet unveiling in the State House, but we really are looking forward to people being able to come and see it in person when the State House reopens to the public. Okay, so the next room we're going to visit is the stateroom. This is the room that is designed to be the principal reception room for the building. So this is where governors from other states or presidents from other countries would be received to await their meetings with the governor or other members of the executive branch. So you can see it's incredibly lavishly decorated. It's got, you know, even more gold leaf than most of the other rooms in the building. You can see the electricity, all these light bulbs showing off the fact that it has electricity, plus this beautiful chandelier. There's incredible furniture, you know, the velvet curtains, velvet covered furniture, this beautiful trompe-l'oeil ceiling, you know, tricking us into thinking that we're looking up at a beautiful blue sky. Here you can see the furniture a little bit better in this image. And then a number of important portraits. And we're going to talk about this portrait of George Washington in just a moment, but there's also a portrait of Oliver Hazard Perry and John Barry, two important early Navy heroes. And then there's also a portrait of Nathaniel Greene, which I think you'll be able to see a little bit here. Yes. And we'll take a better look at that in just a minute. So today the stateroom is used, I should back up, the stateroom is used a lot for press conferences, for bill signings, for meetings, et cetera. And when the governor is giving a press conference, actually, I'm just going to go back. When the governor gives a press conference, I'm still thinking of Governor Raimondo, but he or she will stand at the podium that's at this end of the room, and behind them is the portrait of George Washington. So that's what we're going to look at next. So this portrait of George Washington was painted by Rhode Islander Gilbert Stuart, who was one of the most important portrait painters in America at the time of George Washington's presidency. And so fortunately for Rhode Island, when we wanted to remember Washington after he had passed away, we were able to commission Stuart to paint two versions of this portrait. So this is a well-known portrait type by Gilbert Stuart. There are probably a dozen or so in the world. But the original one was painted for an English nobleman named the Marquis of Lansdowne. And so when you hear about a Lansdowne portrait or its variants, that what that means is that they're showing a full-length portrait of Washington dressed in, you know, presidential garb, as opposed to dressed, you know, as a military hero. So, you know, if you think about paintings of George Washington, for me anyway, the first one that comes to mind is, you know, George Washington crossing the Delaware, or sometimes there are portraits of him on horseback dressed in his military uniform. But here he's dressed as a peacetime leader, a presidential leader, in this incredibly ornate room that looks, you know, a lot like the stateroom, with red velvet and gold tassels. His hand is on some important papers. And so all of this gives us a hint about the way the country was feeling at the time that this portrait was done, right? We were done with war. We were looking forward and hopefully to a peaceful, prosperous future for our country. And if you look in the background, you know, this small detail, but here's the sun breaking through the clouds, and there's even a rainbow parallel to his arm. So again, just a painting that's full of hope and optimism, you know, looking forward rather than backward for our country. There is one little contradiction to that, though, and that is his left hand, which is holding the hilt of a sword. So I think that's just the reminder that if he needed to go to war, you know, if our country needed to go to war, that he would lead us to victory again. And as I mentioned, we had two versions of this portrait done, one for the State House in Newport, you know, called Colony House today, and one for the old State House in Providence. And Rhode Island still has both of these portraits. So we're pretty lucky to have two of these incredibly important works by Gilbert Stuart, you know, here in the state of Rhode Island. At the other end of the room from George Washington is a portrait of Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene was a Rhode Islander who came from a family of Quakers. And so Quakers, or the Society of Friends, you might know, don't believe in war or don't believe in military activity. And so clearly Nathaniel Greene has had to go against his family's wishes to become a soldier. And he did this in spite of also having a limp and having asthma, which, you know, in those days was a much more significant problem than it is today, or a challenge. But he enlisted in the Army anyway at the rank of private, and worked his way up through the ranks until he became second in command to George Washington and the general, basically in charge of the Southern activities during the American Revolution. So, you know, down in Georgia and South Carolina, he's actually known as the savior of the South. And he, after the war ended, was actually given land by the people of Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina to thank him for protecting their cities and towns and farms during the Revolution. Sadly, he died on his farm in Georgia shortly after the war, reputedly of heat stroke, whatever that means, really. And I think that's one of the reasons, though, that we don't know that much about Nathaniel Greene today, or you know, he didn't make that much of a name for himself beyond the war, is because he didn't live long past the war. You know, had he lived longer, perhaps he would have gone on to, you know, run for president or be an important cabinet official. But as it is, we can remember Nathaniel Greene as an important contributor to the American Revolution. So now we're going to visit the legislative chambers. We're looking now through the doors of the state Senate. And before we go inside, I just want to point out this archway here that's got these circles on it. These circles are the seals of the 13 original colonies. And here you can see Rhode Island's seal right in the middle. If we go inside the room, you can see that it's a semicircular room. It's got desks for Rhode Island's 38 senators. Here on the wall, you can see this board that has names on it. And these are the names of all of the senators in Rhode Island. And this board is illuminated whenever they're in session, so that when they vote on a bill, using some buttons that I'll show you in a minute, a little Y or a little N will show up next to their name so that everybody in the chamber will know how everybody else voted. This big desk at the front of the room is the rostrum. This is the desk where the Senate president sits. And the Senate president basically presides over meetings of the Senate. They're elected by their fellow senators, and they decide, you know, what they're going to, what bills they'll consider each day, who gets to speak when, et cetera. So a really important job in the Senate. Above the rostrum is this open area, the gallery, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then this beautiful skylight and ceiling. And there's been some, you know, discussion of the fact that the ceiling looks a lot like the ceiling of one of the major Roman buildings, the Pantheon. And, you know, perhaps McKim, Mead, and White were inspired by the Pantheon when they designed the Senate chamber. Folks, I really do apologize. This is a new feature of Flickr, this ad thing that won't go away, but we're going to overcome it. So here is a picture of what a senator's desk looks like. These are the original desks. These have been here since the building was completed in 1904. Actually, all of the furniture in the Senate, including these desks, is made out of mahogany. We'll contrast that to the wood in the House in just a few minutes. So these are the original desks, but there are, of course, new computers and these buttons that I mentioned. And the buttons are what senators use to vote on bills. So for voting yes or no. This recog button is short for recognition. I usually describe it as the raise your hand button. If you want to say something or you have a question, you can press the recognition button and it lights up a button at the Senate president's desk and he or she can call on you. And then the page button is used to call a legislative page to your desk. So pages are typically high school students, and they might be asked to bring a copy of a bill, other research, you know, or a glass of water, you know, whatever it is that a senator might need in order not to have to leave the floor when they're in session and perhaps miss a vote. And, you know, our pages can be high school students because our legislature is a part-time legislature. They meet basically in after-school hours, typically on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoons from about 4 o'clock on. The past year, of course, has been anything but typical, so their meeting times have been completely different. But in a usual year, it would be, their session would be from January to June on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoons. This is the view from the Senate gallery. So the gallery is the part of the area, part of the Senate that is open to the public. So any member of the public can come sit in the gallery to watch a meeting of the Senate. You don't have to have an invitation. You know, anybody can do this. And it's a pretty great way to see how the Senate does its work. I encourage anybody who's interested to do that. You know, and also just to let you know, though, in case you haven't been a frequent visitor to the State House before, the public is allowed on the Senate floor before the session begins. So if you come to the State House at 3 o'clock and you decide you want to talk to your senator, you can come onto the Senate floor and find your senator and have a conversation with them. When the session begins, and you'll know that the session is about to begin because there's a very loud bell that rings, then the floor is cleared of everyone but the senators or invited guests. And, you know, everybody, the members of the public leave, but you can go and sit in the gallery and watch the Senate session there. So it's also a phenomenal view, as you can see, of the Senate chamber. So I really encourage you to visit the gallery sometime when you're in the State House. All right, the last room I'm going to take you through is the House of Representatives. So this is actually the biggest room in the building. This is where, oh my goodness me, this is where Rhode Island's representatives meet. You can see there are many more desks. That's because we have 75 representatives versus just 38 senators in the General Assembly. But in addition to the House of Representatives meetings, this is also where the governor makes his or her State of the State address. This is where the Electoral College meets to cast their votes. Other important speeches are given in this room because you can really fill it with a lot of people. We set up chairs around the perimeter. You'll see there are actually 2 gallery spaces in the House of Representatives, one here over the rostrum and one here over the doorway. So we can really fill this room up if we have an important event that a lot of people will want to attend. We also have the big black boards, just like in the Senate. So when they're in session, they typically would have the names of all of the representatives listed so that when they vote on a bill, you can see whether they voted yes or voted no. And then at the front of the room, the rostrum, where the Speaker of the House sits. And just like in the Senate, he or she runs the meetings of the House of Representatives. And you can see, oh yes, so I meant to point out the furnishings. So in the Senate, all of the furniture is made out of mahogany. And in the House of Representatives, all the furniture is made out of oak. And you can make of that what you will, but those are the facts. So these are also the original desks, but with new computers and boxes of buttons for voting yes, for voting no, for raising your hand, and for calling a page to your desk if you need something. And here again is a view of the gallery up over the doorway. And this is a view when you're in the gallery. So the gallery, it's modest, right? They're just long benches that you sit in, but you do get this really wonderful view of the House chamber. You can see all of the desks, you can see the rostrum, you can look up and see the beautiful ceiling and the skylight within it. You can also see there are a couple of interesting trompe-l'oeil little tricks of the eye that are going on in the House chamber. The first is that these walls that look like they're made out of stone are actually made out of wood, carved to look like they're made out of stone. And then these designs on the walls, a lot of people assume when they first see them that maybe they're paintings, but in fact they're tapestries. And that was a pretty lavish way to decorate a room in that period. These tapestries were created by a very famous tapestry company in New York City, Baumgarten and Son. And, for starters, they're in a windowless room. And what you see when you look at them is this illusion that maybe you're looking out over a beautiful, country scene. You can see flowers and trees. And even in the background, you can see some ruins that kind of look like ancient Greek or ancient Roman architecture. And those, have sort of 2 functions. Number one is, they highlight the fact that this building borrows very heavily from ancient Greek and ancient Roman architecture. And also that our form of government borrows from those ancient forms of representative democracy. But there are some symbols of Rhode Island in each tapestry. So you see here this circle of flowers. We'll take a closer look at that. You can see there's a woman who has a shield that has an anchor on it, and over her is the word hope, the state motto. And if we look at the next tapestry, you can see another sort of fanciful Italian or Greek garden scene with a little bit of architecture in the background, a little architectural folly, but a symbol of Rhode Island as well in this circle of flowers. And we'll take a closer look at that. So this is another imagined scene of Roger Williams meeting up with Canonicus and Miantinomi, those Narragansett sachems that we talked about earlier. And in case there was any doubt of that, here's the date, 1636, when Roger Williams arrived. Over them, you can see this little banner that says, "What cheer?" And "what cheer" was a typical 17th century English greeting. So instead of hello there or howdy, "what cheer" is what you would say to someone if you saw them on the street. And we know from the historical record that Canonicus and Miantinomi greeted Roger Williams by saying, "What cheer, Netop?" So this tells us that these guys knew some English, and we know that Roger Williams knew some of the Algonquin language. And Netop, sorry, that word Netop means friend in Algonquin. So, you know, that kind of just reminds us of the relationship that they were able to have by being able to communicate with one another in one another's languages. And, you know, in Rhode Island, you see a lot of what cheers. There's a what cheer cafe. I think there's a what cheer brigade, a musical ensemble. And NETOP is another word that you see around the state a lot. And so that's all because that was the way that Roger Williams was first greeted by Canonicus and the antinomy. All right, the last room I'm going to take you to, and I'm only going to do a cursory visit to the library because I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Meg in just a minute. But the library is a magnificent room. It's a public library. That's the most important thing, and Meg will talk more about that. But it's a really beautiful room. You can see it's got 3 levels of books, lots and lots of electricity, right? Lots and lots of light bulbs showing off. And then this very beautiful ceiling. And the ceiling, actually, if you look at it, you can see that the ceiling is similar to the coloring of some of the books in the library. And that's because the whole ceiling was designed to look like the back of an old leather-covered book, right? Once upon a time, all of our books would have been covered with leather, decorated with tooled gold, because they were incredibly precious commodities. These circles that you see represent some of the very earliest book printers, European book printers from the 15th and 16th centuries. There is a funny story actually about this particular one. You can see that this one seal is a little bit darker than all of the others. That seal originally was the seal for Harvard University. And McKim of the McKim, Mead and White partnership, who was the lead architect on the State House job, went to Harvard. And so he thought it would be really fun to put the Harvard seal in among these other European printers' seals. So Theodore Greene, who was first a legislator and then a governor, worked really hard to get the seal removed. He tried to pass legislation to get it removed. He was unsuccessful. And eventually, according to the lore, one night it was gone, or one morning it was gone. So someone snuck in, took out the seal, put in this new seal of another English printer, and so thus went the Harvard seal. Of course, the big question is what happened to the Harvard seal? And the sad answer is I don't know what happened to the Harvard seal, but it was there and then it wasn't. Oh, for heaven's sake. I'm just going to show you one other picture of the seals. So this is another close-up of the seals, and then above them, below them, you can see there is a square that has an R and an I for Rhode Island. All right, so I am now going to turn it over to I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Meg Hamlin-Black, to tell you a little bit more about the library. So just quickly, Meg is the state librarian for the Rhode Island Department of State, and she's responsible for overseeing the state's legislative library. She's the president for the consortium of Rhode Island, she's vice president for the consortium of Rhode Island Academic and Research Libraries Board. She's on the Rhode Island Library Association Board, and she's the chair for the American Library Association's Government Documents Roundtable State and Local Government Documents Interest Group. That's a mouthful. Megan was named one of ALA's emerging leaders in 2019. She graduated with her master's in library science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2015. So Meg, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. So I will share my screen in just a moment, but I will start by talking a little bit about what the State Library is and does and how we've shifted over the years. So the State Library is a legislative library. Our collection spans from 1750 through the present. Materials include state level documents such as laws, executive orders, state agency reports, and then we have federal materials, including hearings and reports to Congress. That top tier of the library is all federal things starting in about 1790 through about the early 1940s. We also have a reference collection such as Robert's Rules of Order, Mason's Manual, some Rhode Island history books, basically anything you need to do government research. We are a team of 3, so it's me and 2 other librarians, and the best thing we do is facilitate access to government information. So even if we don't have it within our 4 walls, we work really hard to connect you with the either state agency or individual who has that information. So talking a little bit about our collection as I go to share my screen. So as I mentioned, our most used collection, our collection spans 1750 through the present, and the 1750 book is part of our most used collection. Lane earlier noted the books we have from the colonial era that talk about when we met in Newport, for the state houses. So these are those books. And these are the most fun thing to share. And what's so exciting about these, so these are the session laws and what the General Assembly did every session. And early years, you can see they ended in God Save the King. Now going in Rhode Island's independent and free thinking spirit, Rhode Island renounced the king on May 4th, 1776. So that's 2 months before the Declaration of Independence. And as part of that, the General Assembly for 2 months ended in God Save the United Colonies. And then in July 1776 and onward, they ended in God Save the United States. And it's just such a lovely, intimate connection to that past to look at that. And these books are part of our most used collection. So anytime you want to see what the law was on the books in 1975 or 1832, we go back, and these books aren't digitized, so we go back to these books and look them up for you. They also have legislative charters. So for example, the Rhode Island Historical Society, their founding was done by the General Assembly, and so it's a legislative charter. And so we have to go back and look, I think 1790s is the latest I've ever had to look for a legislative charter to do that. But these are some of the things that we do with this collection. So the State Library is like all public libraries. We serve two primary purposes. We serve two primary purposes. One is to facilitate access to information. Now at your general public library, that information might be how to use your Kindle or books about gardening or technology, whereas in our library, it is facilitating access to government information. And then the other thing that we do that all public libraries do is provide public gathering space. Libraries are the last or only indoor institution where people can congregate without being required to spend money, which is vital to civic engagement. So the State Library is the only truly public room in the State House for providing gathering space is particularly important. When Secretary Gorbea took office in 2015, she knew the importance of shifting the library to really embracing that public gathering space. So she had the library remodeled, removing a lot of the books that were in the space to our overflow stacks. And in this picture, you can kind of see stacks over here. I forget which one is next. Oh yeah, here's a better photo of how tight the library was. So there are stacks here and stacks here. There's desks over here, and then there were more over there on the other side of the room. And so she had those taken down. There's now just stacks around the edges and one major desk for the public. And she's really opened up the space so we can function, we can offer event space. So when it was remodeled in 2016, removing the cases, and eventually we can see, here we go. And here's the library today. The space is much more open. In non-COVID times, these stanchions aren't here, and we can have events. We say our cap is 80 people, but we've had about 100 standing. And it's everything from press conferences to lobbyists will hold events on a particular bill and teaching people how to do grassroots organizing and saying, hey, these are your elected officials. This is how you talk about the bill that's important to you. And then they disperse. There are meetings, there are, So here's formal meetings, there's informal meetings. We stay open until the rise of the House and Senate. So what that means is, so as Lane mentioned, the House and Senate at around 4 o'clock. We typically close at 4:30. However, we stay open until they are done on the floor and go to committee. And so a lot of lobbyists use us for meeting while the General Assembly is in session. Pages come in to grab things for the legislators, like things like that during session. So we do a lot of that. And what was really great about focusing on the transition from a place where people just came to get access to information to being a dynamic civic space is it also raised awareness of what we do and what we have to offer. We saw a significant increase in our reference questions after we opened it up to events. In 2020, before the pandemic, we were on track to host the most events ever and have the highest reference questions count. Obviously, that all fell off when we closed to the public on March 16th, but it was really cool to have that shift of being a passive place where people who knew what they needed and how to get to us, and shift to more of an outreach of, hey, we have all of these things to offer. So typically the library, and it is a beautiful space to hold events. As you can see here, this is about the census, and you can see Secretary Gorbea giving a press conference. And then we also have fun things, like here's Big Nazo coming in for Spooky State House. And so we've really gotten to activate the space in unique ways, bringing people in who wouldn't otherwise know to come to us with questions. And that now they can ask us questions. So that's how we've shifted from being a passive space to a dynamic space, and we will open it up to questions. Lane? Are you ready?
We did
Yes.
have a question come in earlier, ladies. Judy says, Lane, I toured the State House many years ago as a Girl Scout. Any idea of when tours of the State House will again be offered? And if so, when, how does one arrange for a group tour? And is there a group size limit?
I will answer all of those questions, but first I want Meg to blow you all away by telling you like how many reference questions come in a typical year. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but can you give me a
So last year we had about 2,100 reference questions. We had, so 2019, we had 2,100 reference questions. We had about 40,000 people come through the library. And last year we only had about 1,100 reference questions. However, the majority of those reference questions took over 45 minutes to answer. That's how we break them down. We saw an increase in the depth of questions we answered, even though we saw an overall drop in total questions.
Yeah, so just for anybody who's listening, I mean, I'm not a librarian. I just happen to sit in the library, lucky me. But I'm blown away by the kinds of questions they get asked. You know, and the questions are coming from all corners. It's reporters, it's people down the street, it's people who want to understand about boundary disputes. I mean, it's all sorts of things that, you know, that these guys field. And to me, that's fascinating. But to answer the question, I don't know when the State House is going to reopen. That's really a decision, I think, by the governor, that will be made by the governor's office. I anticipate, if I had to guess, I think it will open in some capacity this summer, but I don't know that for sure. When it reopens, we're just now talking about how we're going to manage the tour program. Pre-pandemic, we actually had a pretty extraordinary offering. We offered free guided tours hourly every workday. So you could come in at 9, 10, 11, 12, 1, 2, 3 and have a free guided tour. You could make a reservation or not. It was totally up to you. In the short term, I know we're not going to be able to do that. I'm certain that we will offer something. And as I say, we're trying to figure it out. The way we've offered tours in the past is through partnerships with local colleges. And so the colleges are also in tough situations with a lot of their students, studying remotely. So all of this is being considered right now, but the best place to get that information is on the Department of State website, which is sos.ri.gov. And on that page, you can go to civics and education, or if you just Google Rhode Island State House tours, it ought to bring you there. But if you go to sos.ri.gov, that's our website. It's actually got a lot of amazing information beyond the State House stuff, but it will give you information about State House tours. There's also a pretty nifty virtual tour of the State House that we created, which kind of works like Google Earth or Google Street View. You can walk, navigate the building on your own. And there's lots of video content and other content. There is not a size limit. Well, no, there is a size limit. I mean, we try and keep groups to 25 or smaller. This is, again, pre-pandemic. I think going forward, we're talking about having groups that are no more than 10 people and no more than 4 pods, so to speak. So it could be like 1 family, 2 couples, and then 2 people on their own, let's say, or something like that. So this is all really being worked out as we speak in terms of how we're going to manage it post-pandemic. So the best way to do it is to feel free to call the Secretary of State's office, and you'll probably get me, or to look on the website, and that will have the most up-to-date information that we have on it. So I think that answers the question. So you can make the reservation online, or you can do it over the phone. I know that we will have more ways for people to tour the building and get information as they're touring it through QR codes and that kind of thing, as well as a kind of an intermediate step. So I would encourage you to come no matter what. And you'll find if you come to the library, someone will answer whatever questions you have about the State House. So that would be my advice. Website plus visit anyway. How high is the dome and how does that compare to the US Capitol? I'm embarrassed to say I don't know the answer to that question. I can tell you something else about the dome though, which I forgot earlier on, which is that it's the 4th largest dome of its kind in the world, but its kind is self-supported marble. So that's a very small niche. There are bigger domes that aren't self-supported. There are bigger domes that aren't marble. But for a dome that is made out of marble and has basically no metal infrastructure holding it in place, it's made like the old-fashioned way, you just put one block on top of the other until you've got a dome. We are the 4th biggest such dome. The biggest one, because people always want to know, is St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The second biggest is actually the Minnesota State Capitol, which was designed by an architect who worked in the McKim, Mead & White firm before going off and designing the Minnesota State Capitol. And then the 3rd largest is actually the Taj Mahal in India. So we're the 4th of that particular kind of dome. But sadly, I don't know the height. And I know in the library, we have a docent from years ago did a pretty exhaustive study of the self-supported marble domes. And we have the diameters of all those domes, but I don't remember them off the top of my head. Any other questions?
I'm not seeing anything else coming through at the moment. We certainly encourage anybody attending. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them at the bottom. In the meantime, I want to say thank you to both of you for taking the time. These are such beautiful photos, and it's been wonderful to hear so much more of the history that I personally did not know existed. So thank you so much.
Oh, here's a question from Louise Thorson. How many volumes in the library, Meg?
Okay, so we have about 30,000 volumes in the library and then probably about 100,000 downstairs. And our collection is constantly rotating. We've been part of the federal depository program, which means the federal government sends us items since it started in 1812 officially, so slightly a few years before that. We don't keep all federal materials from that program, but yeah. So, and not all of them are books. We have a lot of microfiche and we have maps, but the general answer is 130,000.
All right, well then I'll just say thanks so much for having us. It was terrific. I'm really sorry for Flickr's misbehavior on those silly ads. That was a feature that used to exist and then it went away for a while and it popped up literally. I did this earlier today and it didn't happen. So it's come back in a mean way. So I apologize for that. And just encourage you to come to the State House. It's your State House, right? This building belongs to us. People come from all over the world to see this building. I mean, it's an architectural landmark. McKim, Mead & White were famous in the day, still famous, now. And literally, I mean, when, you know, when the building is open, we have tourists come from China, literally, you know, Europe, wherever, to come see the State House. And but the number of Rhode Islanders who come in and say, oh my gosh, I've lived here for 50 years and I've never been to the State House. So don't be one of them. Come and visit us sometime, and certainly come visit us in the library.
Yes, and if you have any questions about Rhode Island government or trying to navigate things, please call us, please email us. And when we are open, you can come see our moon rocks.
Oh, that's right.
I forgot to mention that. We have moon rocks in the library.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Joining us, ladies. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Bye-bye.